1932. A ridge farm outside a town too small to matter on most maps. Silas Hollifield had brought in the last of the corn 2 days before, and now he couldn't straighten his back to close the barn door. He told himself it was the cold snap that had rolled in overnight. Everybody on that ridge blamed the cold. His wife Ruth wasn't so sure. She'd watched him haul feed sacks the same way, at the same angle every morning for 11 years, and she had her own quiet opinion about what was really wearing her husband down. It wasn't the weather at all. It was the years of doing the same motion the same wrong way, and nobody on that ridge had a doctor close enough to tell them so. What they had instead was a woman 2 farms over who kept a book. And that book is where this list starts. Before we get into all 15, let me give you 3 so you know what kind of ground we're covering tonight. Number 11 is a fire balm that farm hands rubbed straight onto sore joints before frost work, and it stings worse than you'd think. Number 6 is a bark salve that trappers carried in their coat pockets for 200 miles at a stretch. And number 10 is the one folks say was doing the same job as the pill bottle in your medicine cabinet, generations before that pill bottle existed. I'm not touching that one until we're most of the way down. I'm Jesse Caldwell, 7th generation on this ridge in the southern Appalachians. My people settled it in the 1800s and never left. Near everything I'm about to walk you through, my great-grandmother Ada wrote down in a receipt book by lamplight, and she made my grandmother promise the old cures would not die with her. This is me keeping that promise. Everything I'm about to share is for educational purposes, rooted in tradition and what's publicly documented. It isn't medical advice. I don't do this channel for me, friend. I do it because we're pulling this knowledge back into daylight, one book page at a time, and if you stick around, you'll want the next one too. Number 15, Wintergreen. Ada wrote about a boy on the ridge, maybe 9 years old, who twisted his ankle jumping off a hay wagon and cried through supper. His grandmother sent him out to the tree line to strip wintergreen leaves, crushed them between 2 flat stones, and rubbed the bruised leaves straight onto the swelling. The smell alone told you something was working that sharp, minty bite that farm families associated with relief long before they knew why. Back then, a jar of wintergreen leaves cost nothing but a walk to the woods. Today, the same compound shows up, refined and bottled, in analgesic creams that run you $10 an ounce at the pharmacy. Wintergreen fell out of home use less because it stopped working, and more because commercial liniments made from the same active compound became easier to buy than to gather. The National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health has noted that methyl salicylate, the compound naturally present in wintergreen, has long been studied for topical use in easing minor muscle discomfort. Nobody on that ridge needed a laboratory to tell them that, but it's nice when the laboratory catches up. A boy stops crying, a grandmother goes back to her supper, and neither one of them thinks twice about it. But wintergreen wasn't the only thing growing wild that families leaned on some remedies, took a little more than a walk to the woods. Number 14, Epsom salt. Coal country, not 2 counties over from where Ada lived, had its own version of ridge medicine. Miners came up from underground with backs that felt like they'd been folded in half, and there wasn't a doctor within 20 miles who had time for every sore back in the county. What they had was a general store that sold sacks of bitter white salt, and wives who ran hot baths the moment their husbands walked through the door. Magnesium sulfate, dissolved into hot water, soaking tired muscles. It's such an old habit that most people forget it ever needed explaining. The Mayo Clinic has acknowledged that warm soaks, Epsom salt included, are commonly used to help ease minor muscle soreness, even while noting the direct absorption science is still debated. What mattered on that ridge wasn't the debate. What mattered was a man who could stand up straight the next morning and go back underground. That's a low bar by today's standards and a high one by his. Number 13, mustard plaster. There's a scene in the receipt book that still gets me every time I read it. A woman named Cordelia, 3 farms south of the Caldwell place, mixing ground mustard seed with flour and warm water into a paste, spreading it thin across a piece of cloth, and laying it over her husband's chest during a hard winter when his joints locked up, something fierce in the cold. The mustard warmed the skin, drew blood to the surface, and the man swore it eased the ache enough to get through morning chores. This was counter-irritation, plain and simple, heat drawing attention away from deep pain. A principle old enough that agricultural extension offices across Appalachia documented mustard plasters as standard household practice well into the 20th century. According to records kept by several state cooperative extension services, it disappeared from common use partly because it's messy, partly because it can irritate skin if left too long, and partly because a tube of store-bought muscle rub does the same warming trick without the cloth and the paste. Cordelia didn't have that option. She had mustard seed and a cold morning. Number 12, clove oil. Ada's book has a whole page just on toothaches because in a place with no dentist for 50 miles, a bad tooth could take a grown man down faster than a broken bone. The remedy was clove oil, dabbed straight onto the aching spot with a bit of cotton. Eugenol, the active compound in clove, has a numbing effect on nerve endings, and dentists used it as a standard practice compound for decades before modern anesthetics took over, a fact still referenced in dental pharmacology texts published by several university dental schools. Store-bought numbing gel does the same job now, in a tube for a few dollars. But there was a stretch of American history where clove oil was the only thing standing between a farmer and a sleepless week, and it did its job well enough to earn a permanent page in the book. Number 11, Cayenne liniment. Here's the firebomb I promised you. Ridge families called it the hot rub, and it was exactly what it sounds like. Cayenne pepper steeped into oil or lard, rubbed onto stiff joints before a long day of frost work. It burns going on. That's the point. Capsaicin, the compound that makes cayenne hot, has been studied enough that it's now the active ingredient in several over-the-counter analgesic patches sold specifically for joint discomfort, a fact the Arthritis Foundation has referenced in its own consumer health materials. Back then, nobody called it capsaicin. They called it the rub that means business. And Ada wrote that Silas Hollifield himself swore by it every frost season, long before that morning in the barn. Here's where it stops being simple kitchen wisdom, friend, because the next remedy on this list isn't just something Ada wrote down. It's something she used on her own daughter. And the way she wrote about it, you can tell it cost her something to put into words. Number 10, willow bark. This is the one I told you I wasn't touching yet. Willow bark tea, steeped slow and bitter, was one of the oldest pain remedies on this ridge, passed down long before Ada's time. The bark contains salicin, a compound the body converts into a substance chemically related to the active ingredient in modern aspirin, a connection well documented in pharmacological history and referenced by institutions including the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History in exhibits on early American medicine. Families brewed it for aches, for fevers, for the kind of discomfort that today sends people straight to the medicine cabinet. What's remarkable isn't that it worked. It's that it worked using almost the exact same chemistry, decades before a German laboratory patented a synthetic version and put it in a bottle with a brand name. The tree was doing the job first. The tree just never got the patent. Number 9, ginger root. Ada's book has a note in the margin next to this one, just 3 words, for Ruth's knees. Ginger root, crushed into a warm poultice and pressed against swollen joints, was a staple for the kind of ache that came from decades of kneeling in a garden or standing over a stove. Ginger's anti-inflammatory compounds have been studied extensively enough that Cornell University's College of Agriculture and Life Sciences has published cooperative extension materials referencing its traditional use for minor swelling and discomfort. Ruth Holifield, if her name in the margin means what I think it means, was not a woman who complained, but she was a woman whose knees ached enough that Ada thought it worth writing down. Number 8. Horseradish root. Sharper and rougher than ginger, horseradish root wrapped in a warm cloth was the ridge's answer to the kind of deep muscle ache that settles into the shoulders after a full day behind a plow. The heat it generates on the skin, real physical warmth, not just a sensation, comes from compounds that increase blood flow to the surface, a mechanism referenced in agricultural extension bulletins from Ohio State University's Cooperative Extension Program, documenting traditional root-based remedies in rural households. It wasn't gentle. Nothing about ridge medicine in 1890 was gentle. But it got a man back into the field the next morning, and that was the only measure that mattered. Number 7, Comfrey. Families called it knitbone, and the name tells you everything about what they believed it did. Crushed comfrey leaf, applied as a cool compress over a bruise or a strained joint, was one of the most trusted external remedies on the ridge, used strictly as a topical compress, never taken internally. A distinction Ada was careful enough to underline twice in her own handwriting. That caution turned out to matter. Modern research has raised safety concerns about comfrey when ingested, which is exactly why traditional use, and the use I'm describing here, stayed limited to the skin. It's a good reminder that the old ways weren't reckless. They had their own rules, and Ada respected every one of them. Number 6. Birch bark. Trappers and hunters on that ridge carried strips of birch bark in their coat pockets the way we'd carry a bottle of pain reliever in a glove compartment. Chewed slightly or steeped into a rough tea out on the trail, birch bark contains compounds related to the same salicin family found in willow, and its traditional use among trail workers and hunters across Appalachia has been noted in regional folklore archives maintained by several state historical societies. It wasn't refined, it wasn't pleasant, but it fit in a coat pocket, and out on a 200-mile trap line in 1870, that mattered more than taste. Number 5. Castor oil pack. This is the one I need to slow down for. I was 7 years old the first time I complained about my knee after a full day of chasing my cousins through Ada's back pasture. I remember telling her it hurt so bad I wasn't going to walk to school the next day, and I remember expecting her to fuss over me the way I'd seen her fuss over my little sister. She didn't. She sat me down at the kitchen table, soaked a flannel cloth in warm castor oil, laid it across my knee, wrapped it snug, and told me something I didn't understand until years later. She said, "Pain that comes from living is different from pain that comes from illness, and you've got to learn to tell the two apart before you go asking the world to fix what a good night's rest will fix on its own." I didn't want to hear that at 7. I wanted sympathy. What I got was a castor oil pack left on overnight, and a lesson about the difference between hurting and being sick that I still carry with me every time I sit down to write one of these scripts. That flannel pack warmed and wrapped over an aching joint before bed was one of the most common overnight remedies across rural households, referenced in home health guides published by Agricultural Extension Services well into the mid-20th century. I woke up the next morning and walked to school just fine. Ada never once brought it up again. She didn't need to. Number 4, sassafras root. Old trappers rubbed sassafras root oil into sore hands and joints after long days working traps in freezing water, and the scent alone sweet, almost like root beer, because root beer itself was originally flavored with sassafras, was as much a part of ridge memory as the relief it was meant to bring. The root's use in traditional American folk medicine has been documented extensively by agricultural and botanical archives, including collections maintained by the United States Department of Agriculture's National Agricultural Library. It's mostly gone from stores now, replaced by synthetic flavoring and synthetic liniment both, but the smell of it still shows up in Ada's book, pressed into the margins next to half a dozen other remedies she clearly favored. Number 3. Apple cider vinegar wrap. Here's where it stops being simple kitchen wisdom, friend. One more time, because this remedy sits right at the edge of what people still argue about today. A cloth soaked in warm apple cider vinegar wrapped around a swollen ankle or wrist was a near universal remedy across ridge households, and its traditional use for minor swelling has been referenced in folk medicine collections housed by several state university agricultural archives. Whether the vinegar itself does the work or whether the warmth and compression do most of it is still debated among researchers today. Ada didn't debate it. She just wrapped it, tied it snug, and moved on to the next chore. Number 2, tallow and herb balm. The all-purpose salve. Every ridge household had a version of this rendered tallow mixed with whatever herbs a family trusted most, cooked slow over a low fire until it thickened into something you could rub into cracked hands, sore joints, tired feet, all from the same jar. It wasn't specialized, it wasn't marketed, it was just what you had. And it did more jobs than any single product on a modern pharmacy shelf because families couldn't afford 5 different products for 5 different aches. One jar, every ache. That was the whole philosophy. And that brings us to the one thing on this list that was never a remedy at all. Number 1, every item on this list, from the wintergreen to the tallow balm, was really about the same thing underneath. It wasn't about the plant. It was about a family that couldn't call a doctor every time somebody's back gave out. So they learned, generation after generation, how to take care of each other with what grew along the tree line and what sat in the root cellar. That's not distrust of medicine. Ada never once said a word against a doctor. She just lived in a place where the nearest one was half a day's ride away, and she refused to let that distance mean her family went untreated. What she left behind in that receipt book wasn't a rejection of modern medicine. It was proof that people can hold on to both the doctor's advice and their grandmother's wisdom without choosing one over the other. That's the real inheritance, not the plants, the refusal to feel helpless. So here's what we walked through tonight, quick, before I let you go. Wintergreen for the ache in a twisted joint. Epsom salt for a miner's back. Mustard plaster for winter stiffness. Clove oil for a bad tooth with no dentist in reach. Cayenne rubbed in before frost work. Willow bark doing the job of aspirin before aspirin had a name. Ginger for a woman's knees, horseradish for a plowman's shoulders. Comfrey, used with care and never swallowed. Birch bark in a trapper's pocket. Castor oil on a boy's knee. And a lesson that outlasted the pain. Sassafras for hands cracked from cold water. Apple cider vinegar on a swollen ankle. And tallow balm, the one jar that did it all. Underneath every single one of them, the same idea. A family that refused to feel powerless just because help was far away. I'm not your doctor, friend. What worked for Granny Ada may not work the same for you. Talk to your doctor before trying anything here, especially if you're already on medication. Tell me something, neighbor. Which one of these did your own grandmother swear by? The one nobody else in your family remembers anymore. Put it in the comments. The remedy that comes up the most is the one I go digging for next, straight out of whatever pages of this book I haven't opened yet. Keep the old ways. They kept us.